Get him out of my sight." The words cracked through the first-class cabin like a gunshot. Every head turned. A fork froze halfway between a porcelain plate and a businessman's mouth. A woman in the second row stopped adjusting the silk scarf around her neck. Even the low mechanical hum of the aircraft seemed to grow louder, vibrating through the polished floor beneath their feet. Richard Coleman was standing in the aisle, tall, rigid, his expensive charcoal suit cut so sharply it looked like armor. One hand gripped the headrest of seat 1A. The other pointed straight at the man sitting beside it. "I don't care who he is," Richard said again, slower this time, his voice thick with disgust. "I am a Platinum Legacy member. I fly this airline 3 times a week, and I am not spending 7 hours sitting next to that." The finger didn't lower. It hovered in the air like a verdict. The man in seat 1B did not move. He sat back in the wide leather seat, one ankle resting casually on the opposite knee. A worn navy hoodie draped over his shoulders, grey sweatpants, scuffed New Balance sneakers that had clearly seen better days. On his lap sat a paperback book, the cover bent and softened from use. He simply turned the page. That quiet motion, the whisper of paper, made Richard's jaw tighten. "Did you hear me?" Richard snapped. The man lifted his eyes. Calm, dark, unbothered. He pulled one ear of his headphones down slightly. "Yeah?" Richard laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Yeah," he mocked. "You're in the wrong seat." The man glanced down at the boarding pass tucked into the seat pocket, then back up again. "Nope," he said mildly. "Seat 1B. I'm good." The air shifted. You could feel it, like the moment before a summer storm breaks across open land. Behind Richard, the boarding line had stalled. Passengers stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisle, craning their necks to see. An elderly couple whispered to each other. A young tech investor 2 rows back lifted his phone just slightly, angling it for a better view. This was not the quiet luxury first class promised. This was theater. Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice but sharpening every word. "This is a transatlantic first-class cabin. Do you have any idea what this seat costs?" The man shrugged faintly. Richard didn't wait for an answer. $12,000, he said, each syllable landing like a hammer. "That's what it costs. People who sit here conduct business. Sensitive business. Confidential business." His eyes flicked down at the hoodie again. "You look like you wandered in from a pickup game at the YMCA. A woman across the aisle sucked in a quiet breath. The man in the hoodie watched him for a moment. Then he closed his book carefully, sliding a finger between the pages to hold his place. "My clothes bothering you?" he asked. "No," Richard said immediately. Then he corrected himself. "Your presence is bothering me." He straightened, smoothing the front of his jacket as if brushing off invisible dust. "You don't fit the demographic," he said, "and frankly, I don't trust you sitting next to my work." Now the murmurs started. Soft, uneasy. The man in seat 1B tilted his head slightly. "Demographic," he repeated. The word hung in the air. Richard turned toward the front of the cabin. "Excuse me," he called out sharply. A flight attendant hurried over from the galley, her professional smile already stretched thin with concern. Her name tag read Emily Carter. 32 years old, 8 years flying international routes, good at reading tension before it exploded. Right now, she could feel the pressure in the cabin like static electricity. "Mr. Coleman," she said carefully, "is there a problem?" "Yes," Richard replied instantly. He gestured dramatically toward the man in seat 1B. "Why is this person here?" Emily blinked once. "This passenger has a valid ticket for seat 1B, sir." Richard gave a short, barking laugh. "Oh, come on." He leaned closer to her, lowering his voice but making sure half the cabin could still hear. "I know how this works. Somebody got upgraded by mistake. Or maybe he talked his way in. Doesn't matter." He waved dismissively. "Move him." Emily glanced down at her tablet, checking the manifest again. The name next to seat 1B made her pause, only for half a second. Then her face went carefully neutral again. "Sir," she said, choosing each word slowly, "the flight is fully booked. I cannot move him." Richard's smile vanished. "Fully booked? Yes, sir." The silence thickened. Richard turned back toward the man in the hoodie. For a long moment he just stared at him. Then something colder entered his voice. "Fine," he said. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out his wallet. "How much was your ticket?" he asked. $500? Maybe you used miles." He peeled off a stack of crisp bills. "I'll give you $2,000 right now to go sit in economy." Gasps rippled across the cabin. The man in the hoodie didn't even look at the money. "My name's Marcus," he said quietly, "and I'm not interested." Richard's lips thinned. "Marcus," he repeated, as if tasting something sour. "Listen carefully. I am the Senior Vice President of Acquisitions at Apex Aeronautics. I am flying to Zurich to close a deal worth billions." His voice rose. "I need space. I need quiet. And I need to not worry about you looking over my shoulder." Marcus watched him for a moment. Then he asked, very calmly, "You worried I might understand what you're looking at?" That landed harder than anyone expected. Richard's eyes flashed. "Don't be clever," he snapped. Behind them, a businessman whispered to his wife, "This isn't going to end well." Emily shifted her weight nervously. "Mr. Coleman," she said softly, "please take your seat. We're delaying departure." Richard ignored her. Instead, he pulled out his phone. "Fine," he said coldly. "Let's see who the airline listens to." He tapped a contact and put the call on speaker. Marcus picked his book back up and opened it again. The calmness of that small act only made the tension worse. The phone rang once, twice, then a voice answered, "Bill Donovan." Richard's grin returned, thin and triumphant. "Bill," he said loudly, "it's Richard Coleman. I'm on flight 402 to Zurich, and you are not going to believe the incompetence happening in your first-class cabin." The entire aircraft seemed to lean in closer. Richard glanced sideways at Marcus, satisfaction already warming his voice. The crew seated a vagrant next to me, refusing to move him. "I need authorization to have this man removed immediately." Marcus turned another page. He didn't even look up. But somewhere deep in the quiet of the cabin, something had begun to shift. And Richard Coleman had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his perfect, expensive life had already started to crack. The call was still on speaker when the cabin lights flickered slightly as ground power shifted through the aircraft. A faint hum rolled through the floor like distant thunder. Bill Donovan's voice crackled through the phone. "Richard, slow down. What exactly is happening?" Richard straightened, sensing an audience. His chest expanded, his voice growing louder, more theatrical. "What's happening is that I paid $12,000 for this seat, and your crew has placed a street bum next to me in first class." Several passengers visibly flinched. Emily Carter's jaw tightened. Marcus Bennett did not react. He turned another page. The sound of the paper moving was soft, but in the tension-filled cabin, it sounded almost deliberate. Bill Donovan hesitated on the line. "A what?" "A vagrant," Richard repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Hoodie, sweatpants, sneakers that look like they've been through a mud run. He refuses to move, and your flight attendant is doing nothing about it." Emily stepped forward. "Sir." "That is not—" Richard raised one finger without looking at her. "Emily, was it?" he said flatly. "Let the adults handle this." The humiliation was subtle, but sharp. Emily inhaled slowly through her nose. Across the aisle, a grey-haired man in a navy blazer shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. His wife leaned closer and whispered, "He's going too far." Marcus heard it. Everyone did. But Marcus simply rested his elbow on the armrest and continued reading. Bill Donovan's voice came again, cautious now. "Richard, what's the passenger's name?" Richard rolled his eyes dramatically. "How would I know? I'm not checking his driver's license." Marcus closed the book, not angrily, not abruptly, just with quiet finality. Then he lifted his eyes. "Marcus Bennett," he said calmly. Richard snorted. "See?" he said into the phone. "Marcus Bennett. That sounds like someone sitting in $12,000 real estate to you." There was a pause on the line. Not long, but long enough for a few people in the cabin to notice. Bill Donovan cleared his throat. "Did you say Bennett?" "Yes," Richard said impatiently. "Why?" Another pause. "This one longer." Richard's confidence wavered for half a second, then hardened again. "Bill, I'm not playing 20 questions here. I want this man removed before we push back. I have sensitive acquisition files open on my laptop. Corporate confidentiality. If this guy glances at my screen, we could be looking at an SEC issue." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Acquisition files," he repeated quietly. Richard ignored him. Bill Donovan finally spoke again, slower now. "Richard, is the passenger threatening you?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Yes." The lie landed in the cabin like a stone dropped in water. Marcus raised one eyebrow. Emily looked at Richard in disbelief. But Richard continued. "He's aggressive," he said smoothly, "refusing to comply with crew instructions. I don't feel safe." Marcus leaned back in the seat. For the first time, he studied Richard the way a scientist studies a specimen. Not angry, not offended, just observing. "Unsafe," Marcus murmured. The phone crackled again. "Put the flight attendant on," Bill said. Emily stepped forward cautiously and took the phone. "This is Emily Carter, lead flight attendant," she said professionally. Bill's voice dropped slightly. "Emily, Who exactly is in seat 1B? Emily glanced at Marcus. Marcus met her eyes, then gave the smallest shake of his head. Almost invisible. Emily hesitated, just for a breath. Then she answered carefully. A ticketed first-class passenger. Another silence on the line. Bill exhaled slowly. "Richard," he said finally, "maybe you should just take your seat so the flight can depart." Richard blinked. "What?" "You heard me." Richard's face darkened instantly. No, that's not happening. Bill, you're missing the point. I am the senior vice president closing the Zurich deal that keeps this company profitable for the next 5 years. You want me working shoulder to shoulder with this guy? Marcus said softly. You talk a lot about money. Richard swung toward him. You're damn right I do. Marcus leaned forward slightly. And you assume money means you're the most important person in the room. The cabin went completely still. Richard laughed. Buddy, in this cabin? Yeah, I probably am. Marcus studied him for another second. Then he leaned back again and reopened the book. Interesting, he said. Richard turned back to the phone. You hearing this, Bill? This guy's taunting me. Bill sounded tired now. Richard, listen to me carefully. Just sit down. Richard's voice dropped into a dangerous whisper. No. Passengers exchanged glances. Richard looked around the cabin slowly, letting the silence build. I think what's happening here, he said carefully, is that your crew is afraid to make a decision. He pointed again at Marcus. So I'll make it simple. Richard leaned toward Emily. Get the captain. Emily hesitated. Sir, the captain is completing pre-flight checks. I don't care, Richard snapped. Bring him here. Now. Emily looked at Marcus again. Marcus didn't move. He was already reading again. Emily nodded once and walked toward the cockpit. The cabin buzzed with quiet whispers the moment she disappeared. A man in row 2 muttered, This is going to end badly. His wife nodded. For someone, yes. Richard heard them. But he interpreted the whispers differently. To him, the audience meant victory. He loosened his tie slightly and sat down in seat 1A, spreading his briefcase open on the tray table like a general laying out battle plans. Marcus glanced sideways. Feeling confident? He asked. Richard smirked. You're about to learn something about how power works. Marcus closed the book again. The corners of his mouth lifted faintly. No, he said quietly. I think you are. Before Richard could respond, the cockpit door opened. Captain David Reynolds stepped out. 6 feet tall, silver hair, 4 stripes on his shoulders, 30 years in the sky. His eyes swept the cabin once, then landed on Marcus. For the briefest moment, something flickered in the captain's expression. Recognition. Richard stood immediately. Captain, finally. He pointed at Marcus. This man is threatening me and refusing to move from the first-class cabin. I want him removed before we leave the gate. Captain Reynolds did not answer. He looked at Marcus. Marcus met his gaze calmly. Then he tapped the side of his nose twice. A small gesture, barely noticeable. But the captain's posture changed instantly. His shoulders stiffened, his eyes sharpened, and suddenly the tension in the cabin shifted direction. like a compass needle snapping toward true north. Richard didn't see it, but everyone else felt it. Captain Reynolds stood still for a moment, studying Marcus Bennett in Seat 1B. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. The sound of the air conditioning whispered softly through the overhead vents. Richard Coleman shifted impatiently beside him, mistaking the silence for hesitation. "Captain," Richard said, sharp and forceful, "I don't think you understand the situation." Reynolds slowly turned his eyes toward Richard. The pilot's face was calm, but something about the calmness felt heavy. Deliberate. Measured. "I understand enough," Reynolds replied. His voice was steady, deep, the voice of a man used to speaking in storms. Richard scoffed. "Then you understand that this passenger is interfering with my work and making me feel unsafe." The word unsafe hung in the air again. Reynolds glanced at Marcus once more. Marcus didn't speak. He simply watched the captain with quiet patience. Reynolds nodded once. Then he turned back to Richard. "Mr. Coleman," the captain said slowly, "take your seat." Richard blinked. "I am in my seat." "Then sit down and stop causing a disturbance." The words dropped into the cabin like a steel weight. Richard stared at him, stunned. "Excuse me?" Reynolds didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You heard me." Richard's face flushed dark red. "Captain, this man doesn't belong in this cabin." Marcus leaned his head slightly to the side. "You keep saying that." Richard ignored him. "Look at him. Hoodie. Sweatpants. You think someone dressed like that bought a first-class seat on a Zurich flight?" Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. A woman 2 rows back whispered under her breath, "Oh my God." Marcus closed his book again and rested it on the tray table. "Captain," Richard pressed, his voice rising, "I am the Senior Vice President of Acquisitions at Apex Aeronautics. I am on this flight to finalize a multi-billion-dollar deal that keeps this airline profitable for the next decade." Reynolds raised an eyebrow slightly. Richard took a step closer. "If this plane leaves with him sitting there, I will personally make sure the board hears about it." The threat hung there, thick and poisonous. Reynolds folded his arms behind his back. "Is that so?" "Yes," Richard said, straightening his jacket, confidence returning. "It's him or me." Silence again. Passengers leaned forward subtly in their seats. Emily Carter stood near the galley entrance, watching with wide eyes. She had flown enough years to recognize the moment when arrogance outruns judgment. Marcus finally spoke again, his tone mild. "You're giving the captain an ultimatum." Richard turned toward him. "That's right." Marcus nodded slowly. "Interesting strategy." Richard smiled coldly. "You're about to learn how corporations work." Marcus stood up, slowly, calmly. When he rose to his full height, the difference between the two men became obvious. Marcus was taller, broader. His posture carried the quiet weight of someone completely comfortable in his own space. Richard suddenly looked smaller, standing in the aisle. Marcus looked down at him, not with anger, but with something far worse. "Assessment." "You talk about corporations," Marcus said quietly, "but you don't seem to understand this one very well." Richard laughed. "Buddy, I helped build this company. Marcus's eyes didn't move. "Did you?" The words weren't a question. Richard gestured toward the cockpit. "Captain, are we done here?" Reynolds didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on Marcus. A strange tension crept through the cabin now, something deeper than the earlier conflict. The kind of silence that forms when people sense something important is about to happen. Marcus slipped his hands casually into the pockets of his hoodie. Then he spoke. "My name," he said calmly, "is Marcus Bennett." Richard rolled his eyes. "You said that already." Marcus continued anyway. 40 years ago, my father founded Apex Aeronautics in a small hangar outside Seattle. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop a few degrees. A man in row 2 slowly lowered his newspaper. Richard frowned slightly. Marcus took another step forward, his voice steady and quiet. 20 years ago, I designed the fuel optimization system that powers the engines on this aircraft. Reynolds straightened subtly beside them. Richard's smirk began to fade. Marcus met Richard's eyes directly. "And 6 months ago, after my father passed away, I inherited 51% of the voting shares in this company." No one moved. The cabin became so silent that the distant clatter of a luggage cart outside the aircraft could be heard faintly through the fuselage. Richard stared at him. For a moment his brain refused to process the words. "That's ridiculous," Richard said finally, but his voice had lost its sharp edge. Marcus didn't blink. "Is it?" Richard shook his head quickly. "The Bennett family trust is controlled by Arthur Bennett. He's—" Marcus interrupted softly. "My father." Richard stopped talking. Marcus continued. "Arthur Bennett died 6 months ago." The words fell like stones. Richard's face slowly drained of color. Around them, passengers were beginning to understand what was happening. A woman near the window covered her mouth. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Marcus leaned slightly closer to Richard. His voice dropped, almost conversational now. "You spend a lot of time talking about money, Mr. Coleman." Richard said nothing. Marcus tilted his head. "But you never bothered to learn who actually owns the company you work for." Reynolds cleared his throat softly. It was not a nervous sound. It was the sound of a man confirming a fact he already knew. Richard's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. His brain was racing now, flipping through fragments of information. Bennett Holdings, majority stake, board voting power, a quiet heir who rarely appeared in public. Marcus stepped back toward seat 1B and picked up his book again. "You should probably sit down," he said calmly. "You're blocking the aisle." Richard didn't move. He stood there, frozen, as the reality slowly crawled across his face like a shadow. The man he had just tried to bribe. The man he had called a vagrant. The man he had tried to throw off the plane was the majority owner of the company that signed his paychecks. And the flight hadn't even left the ground yet. Richard Coleman did not sit down. For several seconds he simply stood there in the aisle, staring at Marcus Bennett as if the man had just spoken in another language. His mind scrambled for footing, searching for some angle, some loophole, some explanation that would restore the order he believed governed the world. "This is a joke," Richard said finally. His voice sounded thinner now. Marcus had already lowered himself back into seat 1B. He reopened the paperback and slid his finger back between the pages where he had left off. "Not a very funny one," Marcus replied. The calmness of the answer made Richard's chest tighten. Captain Reynolds watched the exchange without speaking. His hands rested behind his back, his posture straight, patient. A man who had already chosen his side of the situation. Richard glanced between them. The pilot, the hoodie, the passengers watching. Something inside him refused to accept the shift. "You expect me to believe that?" Richard snapped, louder now. "That the majority shareholder of Apex Aeronautics is flying commercial in sweatpants?" Marcus turned a page. "It's comfortable." The simple response caused a ripple of quiet laughter somewhere in the cabin. Not mocking laughter, nervous laughter. Richard heard it. His jaw tightened. "No," he said sharply. "No, I'm not playing along with this." He turned toward Captain Reynolds again. "Captain, I want this man's identification verified right now." Reynolds looked at him with an expression that carried just a hint of weariness. "Mr. Coleman," he said evenly, "I am well aware of who Dr. Bennett is." The title landed harder than the name. "Doctor." Richard's stomach dropped slightly. "That's impossible," he said. Reynolds tilted his head toward Marcus. "Dr. Bennett has flown with us many times." Marcus didn't look up. Richard laughed again, but it sounded brittle. "Great," he said. "Wonderful. So now the pilot's part of the circus." A murmur spread through the first-class cabin. The grey-haired businessman in row 2 leaned toward his wife again. "He still doesn't get it." "No," she whispered. "He really doesn't." Marcus finally closed the book again. Not irritated, not offended, just finished reading. He set the book down on the tray table and looked directly at Richard. "Mr. Coleman," Marcus said quietly, "do you know what fascinates me about men like you?" Richard crossed his arms defensively. "I'm not interested in your psychology lecture." Marcus continued anyway. "You walk into every room assuming you are the most important person there." Richard scoffed. "In most rooms, I am." Marcus nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the statement. "Yes," he said, "that's the interesting part." The cabin felt smaller now, the air tighter. "Because when someone like you meets someone who actually has power," Marcus continued, "you don't recognize it." Richard's eyes flashed. "I recognize power just fine." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "No," he said softly. "You recognize status, titles, expensive suits." He glanced down briefly at his hoodie. "You mistake the costume for the authority." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck. Something colder was forming in his chest now. Not anger. Fear. But he shoved it down immediately. "You're playing games," Richard said. Marcus raised one eyebrow. "Am I?" Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice so only the immediate row could hear. "You know what I think," Richard whispered. Marcus waited. "I think you're a consultant, maybe a junior engineer who met someone important once, and now you're bluffing." Marcus did not respond immediately. He simply watched Richard. The silence stretched long enough that Richard began to feel exposed standing there. Finally, Marcus said, "That's an interesting theory." Richard's confidence returned a fraction. "Yeah," he said. "It is." Marcus nodded toward Richard's briefcase. "You mentioned earlier you were working on an acquisition." Richard stiffened. "So?" What company? Richard hesitated. Just for a moment. Nova Dynamics, he said finally. Marcus leaned back in the seat. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. And you're closing the deal in Zurich. Richard frowned. How do you know that? Marcus didn't answer the question. Instead, he said, You valued their drone navigation patents at $40 million. Richard froze. The air seemed to leave the cabin all at once. How the hell would you know that? Richard demanded. Marcus reached into the seat pocket in front of him and pulled out an iPad. He tapped the screen once, then turned it so Richard could see. A spreadsheet filled the display. Rows of numbers, valuation models, projected growth curves. Richard recognized it instantly. His stomach dropped like a stone falling through water. That's, he said slowly. Yes, Marcus replied. Your valuation file. Richard's pulse began pounding in his ears. That's confidential, he said. Marcus shrugged. I built the servers your department uses. Richard stared at the screen. The document was identical, down to the formatting, the color coding, the footnotes. His brain raced. You hacked my account, Richard said. Marcus almost smiled. No. He swiped the screen once. Another document appeared. This one shorter, simpler. A transfer record. Richard felt his throat tighten. $2 million. Cayman Islands. Silvergate Consulting. Marcus looked at him calmly. Recognize it. Richard said nothing. Behind them, Captain Reynolds remained perfectly still. Passengers could feel the energy shifting again, though most had no idea what they were witnessing. Richard forced a laugh that sounded hollow. This proves nothing. Marcus tilted his head. It proves quite a lot. Richard leaned closer, his voice suddenly urgent. You don't understand corporate finance. Marcus blinked slowly. Try me. Richard spoke quickly now. Strategic valuation adjustments are common in tech acquisitions. The patents may be undervalued by traditional metrics, but... Stop, Marcus said. The word was soft, but it landed like a command. Richard fell silent. Marcus tapped the screen again. Those patents became obsolete 3 years ago. Richard swallowed. They still have potential market. Stop pitching, Marcus said. The cabin had become completely silent again. Even the whispering had stopped. Marcus's voice dropped slightly. I looked them up this morning while sitting on the floor near gate B12. Richard blinked. Marcus continued calmly. The only thing Nova Dynamics actually owns is a decaying warehouse outside Zurich and a client list that hasn't been updated since 2021. Richard's hands were trembling now. Marcus turned the iPad slightly closer. And yet you recommended Apex pay nearly 200% above their actual value. Richard felt sweat forming at the back of his neck. That's strategic positioning, he said weakly. Marcus met his eyes. No, he said. That's fraud. And suddenly Richard Coleman realized something far worse than embarrassment was unfolding 30,000 feet above the Atlantic. This conversation was no longer about a seat on an airplane. It was about the collapse of everything he had built. Richard Coleman felt the blood drain from his face. For the first time since he stepped onto the aircraft, the cabin around him no longer felt like a stage he controlled. The leather seats, the soft amber lighting, the quiet murmurs of wealthy passengers, none of it belonged to him anymore. It belonged to the man sitting beside him. "That's a serious accusation," Richard said carefully. Marcus Bennett didn't look impressed. "It's a serious file," Marcus replied. Richard straightened slowly, forcing his shoulders back, forcing the familiar confidence into his voice. "You're misinterpreting internal projections," he said. "Tech valuations are fluid. Market optimism is part of acquisition strategy." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Is that what you call it?" Richard gestured at the iPad. "You pulled one document without context. That's not how due diligence works." Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he swiped again. Another document appeared. This one wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a bank record. Richard recognized the Cayman account number instantly. His pulse began pounding in his throat. Marcus rotated the screen just enough for Richard to see the sender. Silvergate Consulting, $2 million, transferred 2 weeks earlier. The timestamp glowed like a confession. Richard felt the ground beneath him tilt. "That's not mine," he said quickly. Marcus watched him the way a surgeon studies an X-ray. "Really?" Richard forced a laugh. "You think I'm stupid enough to take a bribe through a shell company with my own name on the paperwork?" Marcus leaned forward slightly. "You didn't." Richard's breath caught. "You used an offshore registration agent in the Cayman Islands," Marcus continued calmly. "Silvergate Consulting was incorporated through a nominee director. The passengers around them didn't understand the details, but they could feel the tension building like pressure inside a sealed container." Marcus tapped the screen again. "And then you logged into the registration portal from your home address in Greenwich, Connecticut." Richard's mouth opened, closed. Marcus spoke the address without looking down. 42 Maplewood Drive. The words landed like a hammer. Richard staggered back half a step. "How?" he whispered. Marcus leaned back in the seat again. "I built the monitoring protocols for Apex servers in 1998. Richard blinked. "I wrote the backdoor access myself." The cabin seemed to shrink, the walls of the aircraft closing inward. Richard's mind raced through possibilities. Deny, deflect, delay. "It proves nothing," he said again. Marcus didn't argue. He simply watched Richard. The silence stretched. Behind them, Captain Reynolds remained motionless. Passengers had stopped pretending not to listen. A woman across the aisle slowly lowered her magazine. A man in row 3 subtly adjusted his phone camera. Richard leaned closer to Marcus now, lowering his voice. "Listen to me." Marcus waited. "Maybe the valuation is aggressive," Richard whispered. "Maybe due diligence moved quickly. But this isn't criminal." Marcus didn't blink. Richard pressed forward. "Deals get messy. People push numbers. That's the business." Marcus spoke softly. $2 million. Richard's jaw tightened. "You're accusing me of bribery." Marcus tilted the iPad again. "I'm stating a number." Richard felt sweat beginning to form along his collar. "You don't want to do this," he said quietly. Marcus studied him. "No." Richard glanced around the cabin. Every face felt like a spotlight now. "Scandals destroy stock value," Richard said. "If this story leaks, Apex loses billions overnight." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's true." Richard seized the opening. You think the board wants headlines about executive fraud right before a major acquisition? Marcus folded his hands together. You're assuming the board doesn't already know. Richard froze. A cold ripple moved down his spine. What? Marcus's voice remained calm. Internal audit flagged the Nova Dynamics numbers 3 months ago. Richard felt something collapse inside his chest. 3 months, Marcus continued. I've been reviewing your department's files ever since. Richard shook his head quickly. That's impossible. Marcus raised one eyebrow. Is it? Richard tried to think. Think. There's no way you could trace the shell company. Marcus shrugged. The Cayman registry isn't as private as people think. Richard's voice rose slightly. You'd need a subpoena. Marcus smiled faintly. I own the company being defrauded. The smile vanished just as quickly. That speeds things up. Richard's legs felt suddenly weak. He grabbed the back of seat 1A for balance. Around them, the cabin remained silent. Marcus glanced at his watch. We land in Zurich in 4 hours. Richard swallowed hard. So? Marcus's voice was almost conversational. 2 agents from the FBI's white-collar crimes division will be waiting. Richard stared at him. You're bluffing. Marcus didn't answer. Richard laughed nervously. You can't just call the FBI mid-flight. Marcus looked at him. I forwarded the financial records to the SEC and the Department of Justice while we were taxiing. Richard's stomach twisted violently. You're lying. Marcus held his gaze. Am I? Richard turned toward Captain Reynolds suddenly. This is insane, he said. You're going to let him threaten a senior executive on your flight? Reynolds looked at him calmly. No one is threatening you. Richard's voice cracked. Yes, he is. Marcus spoke again. You're fired. The words were quiet, but they hit harder than anything else that had been said. Richard blinked. You can't fire me. Marcus didn't raise his voice. You ceased being an Apex employee the moment this aircraft left the ground. Richard laughed again, desperate now. That's not how corporate termination works. Marcus tilted his head slightly. You're right. Richard felt hope flicker. Marcus continued. Technically, you're also trespassing. The flicker died. Richard stared at him. What? Marcus gestured around the first-class cabin. This aircraft belongs to Apex Aeronautics. He paused. And you no longer work here. The implications settled slowly, like fog creeping across a field. Richard's hands began to tremble. You can't prove anything, he said. Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes. You'd be surprised. Richard stood there in the aisle, breathing hard, realizing that somewhere between boarding the plane and reaching cruising altitude, the balance of power in his life had flipped completely, and the flight had only just begun. The engines roared to life as the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate. The sudden vibration rolled through the cabin floor, a deep mechanical growl rising beneath the polished quiet of first class. Outside the window, the runway lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. Inside the cabin, no one spoke. Richard Coleman lowered himself slowly into seat 1A. His legs felt hollow. Across the armrest, Marcus Bennett had already leaned back again, his seat slightly reclined, the paperback resting lightly in his hands. The man looked like someone settling in for a quiet flight, not like someone who had just detonated another man's career. The aircraft turned onto the taxiway. The engines grew louder. Richard stared straight ahead at the curved wall of the cabin. Think. That was all his mind screamed. Think. He had survived hostile negotiations with billion-dollar hedge funds. He had outmaneuvered regulators. He had talked his way through 2 SEC audits and 1 near disaster involving insider trading rumors in 2019. He could survive this. He had to. The plane accelerated. Outside, the runway lights stretched into a glowing tunnel. The engines howled, and suddenly the aircraft surged forward. Gravity pressed Richard into the seat as the Dreamliner raced down the runway. Marcus didn't look up. He simply turned another page. The wheels lifted. The cabin tilted. And in that moment, Richard realized something terrifying. The plane was now beyond the point of turning back. 10 minutes later, the aircraft leveled at cruising altitude. The soft chime sounded. Passengers loosened seatbelts. The quiet routine of long-haul travel resumed. But not for Richard. His hands were shaking. Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman pretended to scroll through his tablet, but his eyes kept flicking towards seat 1A. Everyone in the cabin knew something had happened. They just didn't know how big it was. Emily Carter appeared in the aisle, pushing the beverage cart. Her smile was professional again. But when she reached row 1, something subtle changed. She stopped beside Marcus first. "Dr. Bennett," she said softly. Her voice was warmer now. "Genuine. It's an honor to have you flying with us again." Richard felt the words like a slap. Marcus lowered his headphones. "Hi, Emily," he said casually. "You remembered?" She smiled. "You fixed that jammed cart latch on the Tokyo flight 3 years ago. I don't forget things like that." Marcus chuckled quietly. "Mechanical problems bother me." Richard stared at them. The owner of Apex Aeronautics. Fixing a cart latch. Emily handed Marcus a glass. Sparkling water with lime. No ice. Marcus nodded. "Perfect." Then she turned to Richard. The warmth vanished instantly. "Mr. Coleman," she said flatly. Her tone carried the cold efficiency of someone who had already chosen where she stood. "Drink?" Richard swallowed. "Scotch," he said. "Blue Label." "Neat." Emily glanced at the cart. "We're out of Blue Label." Richard saw the bottle sitting clearly in the rack. He didn't argue. "Fine," he muttered. "The house blend." She placed the glass on his tray table. No napkin, no nuts. The cart rolled away. Marcus sipped his water quietly. Richard stared at the amber liquid in front of him. His reflection floated in the glass, distorted, smaller. His mind raced again. 4 hours. That was what Marcus had said. 4 hours until Zurich. 4 hours until the FBI. Unless. Richard reached slowly into his jacket pocket. His phone. He turned slightly away from Marcus and opened the corporate portal. The onboard Wi-Fi crawled painfully slow. The login page finally appeared. His fingers trembled as he typed. H_Sterling_exec. Password titanium_88. Enter. The loading circle spun. Then the message appeared. Access denied. User account disabled. Contact administrator. Richard felt his stomach drop. He tried again, and again. Access denied. His breathing grew shallow. It's gone, a voice said quietly. Richard froze. He turned slowly. Marcus had not moved. His eyes were closed. The noise-cancelling headphones rested over his ears. But one ear cup slid slightly aside. I had your digital credentials revoked 10 minutes after we took off, Marcus said calmly. Richard's pulse hammered. You can't do that. Marcus opened one eye. I just did. Richard gripped the armrest. You're destroying the company's best acquisition executive. Marcus looked mildly amused. You were destroying the company's balance sheet. Richard leaned closer, desperation creeping into his voice. $2 million, he whispered. That's nothing to you. Marcus studied him. That's your defense? Richard spoke faster. You have billions. Apex moves tens of billions a year. You're blowing up a career over a rounding error. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He stared out the window for a moment. The Atlantic stretched below them, black and endless. Then he turned back. That money doesn't belong to me, Marcus said quietly. Richard frowned. What? Marcus's voice remained calm. It belongs to every machinist on the assembly floor in Seattle. Every engineer designing these engines. Every janitor cleaning the hangars at night. Richard scoffed. They're employees. Marcus leaned forward slightly. They're the company. Richard waved a hand dismissively. You're romanticizing labor. Marcus watched him for a long moment. My father started as a mechanic, he said quietly. Richard didn't answer. Marcus continued. He knew every name on the assembly line. The silence returned. Heavy. Richard looked away. He suddenly needed air. I need the restroom, he muttered. He stood quickly and walked toward into the galley. Emily Carter sat on the jump seat, reading a paperback under the small overhead light. She looked up when Richard approached. Her expression was blank. Mr. Coleman. Richard leaned closer, lowered his voice. Emily, he whispered. She didn't respond. I have cash in my briefcase. Her eyes narrowed slightly. $10,000, Richard said. The words tumbled out quickly now. When we land, delay the door opening. Spill coffee on the jet bridge. Anything. Emily stared at him. Richard's voice grew more desperate. I just need 2 minutes. 2 minutes to disappear into the terminal. Emily stood slowly. She was shorter than him. But in that moment, she felt taller. My father worked maintenance for Apex for 20 years, she said quietly. Richard blinked. He lost his pension during the 2008 crash. Her eyes hardened. Men like you. Richard's throat tightened. Emily pointed back toward seat 1A. Go sit down. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had already made her decision. Or I wake the captain and we divert this plane to Newfoundland. Richard stared at her. For the first time in his career, every escape route he could imagine had already been closed. and the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly below the aircraft. 4 hours left, and nowhere left to run. Richard Coleman walked back to seat 1A like a man moving through water. Every step felt heavier than the last. The first-class cabin looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. The same soft amber lights, the same polished wood trim, the same quiet luxury meant to soothe the most powerful travelers in the world. But something fundamental had shifted. When Richard sat down this time, the seat no longer felt like a throne. It felt like a car. Marcus Bennett glanced at him briefly, then returned his attention to the iPad resting on the tray table. On the screen was not a movie, not an email. A complex set of aerodynamic diagrams rotated slowly across the display. Winglet geometry, airflow modeling, numbers that looked like physics, not finance. Richard stared at it for a moment before looking away. He suddenly realized something deeply unsettling. Marcus wasn't thinking about him. The man who had just dismantled his entire career was now calmly reviewing aircraft design as if none of it mattered. Richard's chest tightened. "You're really just going to sit there?" he muttered. Marcus didn't look up. "Yes." Richard leaned closer. "You've made your point." Marcus scrolled through the diagram. "No," he said. "I haven't." Richard swallowed. "You think humiliating me fixes anything?" Marcus tapped the screen again. "It isn't about humiliation." Richard laughed bitterly. "Could have fooled me." Marcus turned the tablet slightly so Richard could see the engineering model. "This winglet reduces drag by 4.3%, Marcus said calmly. Richard frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" Marcus finally looked at him. "My father spent 40 years building this company, so airplanes could fly farther, safer, and cheaper." He paused. "You tried to turn it into a personal ATM." Richard's jaw tightened. "That's not what happened." Marcus tilted his head. "Then explain it." Richard leaned forward again. His voice dropped into the persuasive tone that had closed hundreds of deals. "Look," he said quietly, "maybe the Nova Dynamics valuation got aggressive, but acquisitions are about risk." Marcus watched him without blinking. Richard continued. "You swing big. Sometimes numbers shift." "That's business." Marcus waited. Richard leaned even closer. "But we can still fix it." The word hung between them. "Fix." Marcus repeated it, softly. "How?" Richard glanced around the cabin. Passengers were pretending not to listen. But they were. Every single one. He lowered his voice further. "I resign quietly," Richard whispered. Marcus said nothing. "The deal gets renegotiated when we land," Richard continued. "The shell account disappears." Marcus studied him. "And the $2 million? Richard hesitated, then forced a smile. "You keep it." Marcus blinked once. Richard nodded eagerly. "You're the majority shareholder. Technically, that money belongs to Apex anyway." Marcus leaned back slowly. Richard felt hope flicker again. "You're offering to bribe me," Marcus said calmly. Richard waved a hand. "I'm offering to solve a problem." Marcus stared at him for several seconds. Then he laughed. Not loudly, not angrily. Just once. A dry sound. "You really don't understand this situation," Marcus said. Richard felt the hope collapse instantly. "You think this is about money?" Marcus leaned forward again, his voice dropping slightly. "You think every problem in the world has a price?" Richard opened his mouth to argue. Marcus raised one finger. "Let me tell you something." The cabin seemed to grow quieter. "My father once fired a man who tried to steal $1,200 worth of equipment from a hangar." Richard frowned. $1,200? Marcus nodded. "The board told him to let it go. Said the man had 3 kids. Richard crossed his arms. "So?" Marcus's eyes hardened slightly. "My father said if you let someone steal a small thing, eventually they'll steal the whole company." Richard shifted in his seat. Marcus leaned back again. "You didn't steal $2 million. Richard blinked. Marcus continued calmly. "You stole trust." The words settled heavily between them. Richard looked away. For the first time that night, he had no answer. Minutes passed. The plane hummed steadily through the night sky. Outside the windows, the Atlantic was nothing but black emptiness. Richard stared down at the tray table. The Scotch glass sat half full. His reflection in the liquid looked distorted, weak. Finally, he spoke again. "Why sit next to me?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You could have fired me months ago." Marcus nodded. "That's true." Richard looked up. "Then why this?" Marcus closed the iPad. The click of the case sounded sharp in the quiet cabin. "I wanted to meet you." Richard frowned. "What?" Marcus rested his arms on the armrests. Internal audit flagged the Nova Dynamics numbers 3 months ago. Richard's chest tightened again. Marcus continued. "But numbers don't tell you who someone is." He gestured lightly toward Richard. "So I booked seat 1B. Richard stared at him. "You're saying you planned this?" Marcus nodded. "I wanted to see how you treated people when you thought no one important was watching." The words hit harder than any accusation. Richard's mind replayed the last 2 hours instantly. The gate agent, the lounge attendant, Emily, the insult, the word thug, the demand to remove Marcus. Marcus spoke again, quietly. "I hoped you'd surprise me." Richard swallowed. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked directly at him. "I thought maybe you were just under pressure. Maybe you were still salvageable." Richard felt his chest tighten painfully. "And?" he asked. Marcus's expression didn't change. "You opened your mouth." The sentence ended the conversation. The aircraft continued west across the Atlantic night. And somewhere beneath the quiet hum of the engines, Richard Coleman realized something terrifying. This entire flight had never been about a seat. It had been a test, and he had failed it before the plane even left the gate. The cabin lights dimmed slowly as the aircraft crossed deeper into the Atlantic night. Most of the passengers in first class had settled into the quiet rhythm of a long flight. Screens glowed softly. A few seats were reclined into beds. Someone snored faintly behind the curtain separating the galley. But seat 1A remained rigidly upright. Richard Coleman sat motionless, staring at the dark oval of the window. He had not slept. He had not touched the meal that had quietly appeared on his tray. Across the armrest, Marcus Bennett had reclined his seat completely flat. A thin blanket rested over him, one arm folded behind his head, noise-cancelling headphones still covering his ears. He looked like a man resting peacefully, not like someone who had just ended another man's life as he knew it. Richard's mind had spent the last 3 hours racing through every possible escape, every loophole, every connection, every angle. They all collapsed. He had tried to log into the Apex cloud servers again. Locked out. He tried his personal email. Locked out. His corporate messaging account. Disabled. His phone buzzed once earlier when the aircraft briefly crossed a satellite coverage corridor. A single message had appeared before the signal dropped. From Apex Legal. Do not contact any company personnel. The message felt colder than anything Marcus had said. Richard rubbed his face with both hands. Think. There had to be something. Some narrative he could control. The cabin remained quiet until a voice beside him spoke softly. You still awake? Richard froze. He turned his head slowly. Marcus had removed his headphones and pushed himself slightly upright. His voice carried no anger, no triumph, just quiet observation. Richard swallowed. You planned everything. Marcus shrugged. Not everything. Richard stared at him. You booked that seat on purpose. Marcus nodded. Yes. Richard let out a short breath. You spent months building a case. Marcus tilted his head slightly. I spent months confirming one. Richard looked away. His throat felt dry. Why not just fire me in Seattle? Marcus leaned back against the seat. I told you. Richard said nothing. Marcus continued. I wanted to see the person behind the numbers. Richard laughed quietly. You saw him? Marcus studied him for a long moment. Yes. Silence filled the space again. Richard looked down at his hands. They were trembling again. I can cooperate, he said quietly. Marcus didn't respond. Immediately, Richard pressed forward. I know things. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What kind of things? Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice instinctively, even though half the cabin was asleep. There are other executives taking kickbacks. Marcus watched him carefully. Names. Richard hesitated only a moment. Logistics department. Catering contracts. London office payroll. Marcus said nothing. Richard continued quickly. I can testify. Marcus finally spoke. You're offering to trade them for yourself. Richard nodded. That's how investigations work. Marcus studied him with a strange expression. Not anger. Something closer to disappointment. I already know about the logistics contracts, Marcus said quietly. Richard blinked. Marcus continued. We cleaned house there last week. Richard felt another cold drop inside his stomach. Marcus went on. And the London payroll scheme ended 3 months ago. Richard stared at him. You already knew? Marcus nodded. You were the last domino. The word domino echoed uncomfortably. Richard leaned back slowly. The aircraft hummed steadily through the night. Outside the window, the horizon had begun to lighten faintly, a thin grey band stretching across the edge of the world. Morning over Europe. Richard felt a strange numbness creeping in. "How long?" he asked quietly. Marcus looked out the window. "Until we land." Richard shook his head. "No." Marcus glanced back. "How long have you known?" Marcus considered the question. 3 months? Richard let out a long breath. "And you said nothing?" Marcus shrugged slightly. "People reveal themselves when they think no one important is watching." Richard rubbed his temples. "I built half the acquisitions division." Marcus didn't argue. "Yes." Richard's voice hardened slightly. "You're destroying one of the most profitable executives in the company." Marcus answered calmly. "You were destroying the company." Richard shook his head. "No." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "You tried to overpay for a worthless company by 200%. Richard's jaw tightened. "That's negotiation." Marcus met his eyes. "That's theft." The word hung in the air like cold steel. Richard looked away again. For the first time since boarding the aircraft, he felt something worse than fear. Shame. It crept slowly through him, heavy, unavoidable. "You don't understand what it takes to get to my level," Richard muttered. Marcus watched him quietly. "You claw your way up," Richard continued. "Every deal is a fight. Every promotion is a war." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know." Richard laughed bitterly. "No, you don't." Marcus raised one eyebrow. "You think I inherited this company and just showed up one day?" Richard said nothing. Marcus gestured toward the engines humming outside the wing. "I designed the fuel optimization system that powers those." Richard frowned. Marcus continued. "I spent 15 years inside wind tunnels and simulation labs." Richard stared at him. Marcus leaned back again. "My father didn't give me Apex." He paused. "He gave me responsibility." The cabin remained silent. The first streaks of sunlight began to spill across the clouds outside, gold and purple stretching over the distant Alps. Richard watched the light slowly fill the window. It looked strangely beautiful, like the world continuing without him. Finally, he spoke again. "What happens when we land?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "You are arrested." The words landed gently, but they carried the final weight of gravity. Richard closed his eyes. For the first time in decades, he had absolutely no idea what move came next. And somewhere below the aircraft, the mountains of Switzerland were rising to meet them. The first announcement came just as the sun broke over the horizon. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've begun our initial descent into Zurich. Weather is clear this morning, temperature 40 degrees. Cabin crew, please prepare the aircraft for landing." The voice echoed softly through the cabin. Seatbelts clicked, window shades lifted. Passengers stretched and yawned, unaware that the most important drama on the aircraft had already played out during the long Atlantic night. Richard Coleman did not move. His hands rested on the armrests, fingers stiff and pale. The dried stain of spilled scotch still darkened the expensive fabric of his trousers. Across from him, Marcus Bennett had already sat upright. His hoodie was gone. Sometime during the night, he had changed into a simple black sweater and dark jeans. His hair was neat now, his beard trimmed. He looked like someone who had just woken from a restful night. Richard looked like someone who had aged 10 years. Emily Carter appeared quietly beside them. "Good morning, Dr. Bennett," she said softly. Marcus smiled politely. "Morning, Emily. Coffee?" "Black." She handed him the cup carefully. Then she turned to Richard. "Breakfast tray was placed on your table earlier, sir." Richard glanced down. A croissant and a bowl of fruit sat untouched. "I'm not hungry," he muttered. Emily nodded once. No sympathy, no judgment, just acknowledgement. She moved down the aisle. Marcus took a slow sip of coffee and looked out the window. The Swiss Alps rose beneath the aircraft like a frozen ocean of jagged white peaks. Beautiful, unforgiving. Richard watched them too. His voice came out hoarse. "My family." Marcus didn't look at him. "They're fine." Richard swallowed. "They raided my house, didn't they?" Marcus nodded slightly. "Yes." Richard closed his eyes briefly. "My wife." "The FBI handles those situations carefully," Marcus said. "That doesn't make it easier," Richard replied. Marcus said nothing. The plane dipped slightly as it banked toward the runway approach. The seatbelt sign chimed again. Richard felt a faint vibration in his pocket. His phone. He pulled it out. Signal had returned briefly as the aircraft dropped below 10,000 feet. Notifications flooded the screen instantly. 14 missed calls. His wife. 3 calls from Bill Donovan. 1 message from Apex Legal. "Do not say anything. Authorities are already involved." Another alert appeared. LinkedIn account suspended pending investigation. Then 1 more. Chase Bank. All accounts temporarily frozen. Richard stared at the screen. The digital avalanche of consequences. "My kids were home," he whispered. Marcus looked out the window. "Yes." Richard dropped the phone onto the tray table. The plastic clattered loudly in the quiet cabin. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Richard turned slowly toward him. "Why the theater?" Marcus glanced back. "You could have fired me months ago. Sent the evidence to prosecutors quietly." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "Why sit next to me on a plane?" Marcus studied him carefully. The aircraft lowered through a layer of thin cloud. Sunlight flooded the cabin. Every wrinkle in Richard's face became visible now. Marcus spoke quietly. "My father believed in second chances." Richard frowned. Marcus continued. "He used to say a man can get lost, but sometimes he can still find his way back." Richard stared at him. "So you gave me a chance?" Marcus nodded once. Richard laughed softly. "That's what this was." Marcus didn't respond. Richard leaned back in his seat. "I failed." Marcus met his eyes. "Yes." The landing gear deployed with a heavy mechanical thud beneath the floor. Wind roared louder along the fuselage. Outside the window, the runway rushed toward them. Green fields, grey tarmac, terminal buildings. Richard gripped the armrests tightly. The wheels struck the runway with a sharp jolt. Thump, thump. Reverse thrusters roared. The aircraft slowed quickly, vibrating slightly as it rolled along the runway. Passengers relaxed. Phones appeared. People checked messages. The plane taxied slowly toward the gate. Richard looked out the window and saw them. 3 black SUVs parked beside the terminal. 2 Swiss police officers standing near the jet bridge. A pair of men in dark jackets with yellow letters on their backs. FBI. Richard's stomach twisted. Marcus noticed his gaze. "They're punctual," Marcus said quietly. The aircraft stopped at the gate. Engines wound down. The familiar calm returned to the cabin. But this time, it felt heavier. Final. Emily's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for a moment while airport authorities board the aircraft." Passengers looked around in confusion. Authorities? A murmur rippled through the cabin. The door opened. Cold Swiss air rushed inside. 4 men entered. 2 Swiss officers, 2 FBI agents. They walked straight down the aisle without hesitation. Every head in first class turned to watch. They stopped at seat 1A. One of the agents looked down at Richard. Richard Coleman. Richard nodded slowly. "I'm Special Agent Harris," the man said. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering." The words sounded almost routine, like they had been spoken 100 times before. But to Richard, they echoed like thunder. The agent removed a pair of silver handcuffs. "Please stand." Richard rose slowly. His knees nearly buckled. The cuffs clicked around his wrists. The sound was sharp. Final. Passengers stared openly now. A man in row 3 lifted his phone to record. An elderly couple watched with wide eyes. Richard turned once more. Marcus Bennett stood calmly in the aisle with a small backpack slung over one shoulder. Their eyes met. Marcus spoke quietly. "Goodbye, Richard." Richard tried to say something. Apologize. Explain. Beg. But nothing came out. The agents turned him toward the exit. They walked him down the aisle, past the silent passengers, past the galley, past the door, out of first class, out of the aircraft. And for the first time in 20 years, Richard Coleman left a plane not as an executive, but as a prisoner. 3 weeks later, the cell door slammed shut with a hollow metallic echo. Richard Coleman sat on the narrow metal cot inside a holding facility outside Zurich. The walls were painted a dull institutional grey that seemed to absorb every bit of light in the room. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold steel. Nothing in the room resembled the life he used to live. No leather seats, no polished marble floors, no assistants waiting outside his office. Just a thin mattress, a stainless steel sink, and silence. Richard wore an orange prison jumpsuit that scratched against his skin whenever he moved. His expensive Tom Ford suits had been taken the first night he arrived, along with his watch, his cufflinks, his phone, everything that used to define him. Across the small table sat his court-appointed Swiss attorney, Daniel Weber, flipping slowly through a thick folder of documents. "Mr. Coleman," Weber said calmly, adjusting his glasses, "the United States Department of Justice has formally filed extradition charges." Richard stared at the grey wall. Weber continued, "It is not only the Nova Dynamics case." Richard's eyes closed. The lawyer slid several pages across the metal table. Once investigators accessed your servers, they discovered additional irregularities. Richard didn't reach for the papers. Weber listed them quietly. Kickbacks tied to catering contracts in 2019. Phantom employees registered in the London payroll system. Offshore accounts connected to consulting agreements. Richard let out a long breath. How much time? The lawyer answered without emotion. Federal sentencing guidelines suggest 15 to 20 years. The number hung in the room like thick smoke. Richard nodded slowly. Weber continued. Your assets have been frozen. The house in Greenwich. The Cayman accounts. Your vehicles. Richard looked down at his hands. They felt older now. Weber hesitated before speaking again. There is one more matter. Richard already knew. But he waited. Your wife has filed for divorce. The words landed softly. She claims she had no knowledge of your activities, Weber said. She is cooperating with investigators in order to retain the house for your children. Richard leaned back against the wall. For the first time since the arrest, he allowed the reality to fully settle. The career was gone. The money was gone. The reputation he had spent decades building had evaporated in a single transatlantic flight. Weber gathered his documents. You will be transferred to the United States within the week. The lawyer stood. Prepare yourself, Mr. Coleman. The door closed behind him. Richard remained sitting on the cot. The silence in the cell was heavy, but it was honest. For the first time in years, there was no deal to negotiate, no room to maneuver, no audience to impress. Just consequences. Thousands of miles away in Seattle, the atmosphere inside Apex Aeronautics headquarters could not have been more different. The main auditorium was filled with employees, engineers in work jackets, machinists with grease still on their hands, office staff, technicians, interns. Nearly 3,000 people packed the room. At the center of the stage stood Marcus Bennett. He wore the same simple black sweater and dark jeans he had worn on the plane. No suit, no tie, just the quiet confidence of someone who no longer had anything to prove. The room fell silent as he stepped toward the microphone. 3 weeks ago, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. I took a flight to Zurich. Employees listened closely. I sat next to a man who believed his title made him more important than everyone around him. Marcus paused. He believed leadership meant shouting orders and collecting bonuses. A few employees exchanged glances. Marcus continued. He was wrong. The room remained still. My father built Apex with people who got their hands dirty. Mechanics, engineers, people who believed integrity mattered more than ego. Marcus looked out across the crowd. I will not allow that culture to be replaced by greed. A murmur of approval moved through the room. Marcus lifted a small folder. Effective today, the executive bonus pool for this fiscal year is being eliminated. A ripple of surprise spread through the audience. That money, Marcus continued, $40 million, will be redirected to the employee pension fund and an immediate cost of living increase for hourly workers. For a moment, the room was silent. Then the applause exploded. Workers stood. Some cheered. Others wiped their eyes. In the back rows, a group of machinists slapped each other on the shoulders, grinning. Marcus stepped back from the microphone. The applause rolled through the hall like thunder. Back in the Zurich detention facility, Richard Coleman sat on the edge of his cot as a guard walked past the bars. Down the corridor, a small television played CNN International. The headline across the screen read, "Apex Aeronautics. Stock surges. 15% after corporate restructuring." Then the image changed. Richard's old corporate headshot appeared. Sharp suit, confident smile, perfect lighting. Below it another headline appeared. "Former Apex executive faces 20 years." Richard stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he looked away. For most of his life, he had believed power came from titles, from money, from the seat you occupied in a first-class cabin. But somewhere over the Atlantic, a quiet man in a hoodie had proven something different. Real power doesn't shout. It doesn't demand respect. And it certainly doesn't judge a person by their clothes. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody bothered to notice. And sometimes all it takes is one seat on a plane to expose the truth. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. And in the comments, share 3 simple words that sum up what you just witnessed. Truth always wins.